Hi guys. Okay, today I'm going to do a tutorial on one pose. We're going to really break it down. I'm going to show you lots of modifications, lots of variations, and it's going to be downward facing dog. Now the reason that I've chose this pose is because it's quite a challenging pose. It doesn't look particularly difficult from the outside when you see people in the shape of the pose, but to get it to the point where it's a comfortable pose for you to do, where it's a pose that you really enjoy, that you can hold for long periods, there is a few bits and bobs that really help to put that in place. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through all the teaching points over the years. I've been doing this for, as you know, for over 25 years teaching, 24 years teaching yoga, 30 years teaching fitness. And every time you go on a training course, you get different variations and different ways of doing certain poses. Every style of yoga that I've come across has got a different way of doing downward dog as well. And there really is no one size fits all. It's like anything. It's a case of playing around with the variations, see what works best for you, listen to your body. But I'm just going to show you all the different bits and bobs that I've learned over the years, and hopefully maybe some of them might help you enjoy the pose a little bit more. If you're familiar with the pose, feel free to skip ahead on this video. And I'll show you some more advanced variations that you can add into your practice as well. But we're just going to break it all right down. I'm going to show you kind of some of the main teaching points, some of the various teaching points that you can play around with, the reason behind the pose, what things can make it feel particularly challenging for certain people, and things that you can do as well to just help make it a safer pose. It's a lovely posture, but obviously it is quite a challenging posture and there's a lot of weight bearing involved. So I'm going to start off by just giving you a quick demonstration of downward dog, just so that you're aware of what I'm talking about, for those of you that are beginners. So it's a pose that we often move into through, say, a sun salutation sequence, and you'd perhaps lift up into it from a cobra position or from a box position, and it's just our little inverted V shape, really. It's like a triangle shape, isn't it, with our hands and feet as our base. And the point of the pose is to give you a really good stretch back line, particularly down the backs of the legs, from the heels, calves, hamstrings. And then it's a really great opening pose for the front line, arms, chest, upper body gets a really good stretch as well. But it's also a strengthening pose for the back body, and it's a really great pose for bone density as well, for increasing the bone density, the strength in the upper body, in particular shoulders, wrists, forearms. But because of that, because it's a weight-bearing pose, a little bit like poses like plank and crow, it is a case of practicing little and often. Don't suddenly start to do it every day for half an hour at a time, otherwise you are going to get sore. So let your body get used to it gradually, build up the amount of time you're going to spend in the pose. Now, one of the things to start with that I find I really struggled with at the very beginning, moving into yoga as a fitness instructor, great cardio strength, great kind of strength and stamina, flexibility, but I wasn't used to doing an awful lot of loading on the wrist joints, apart from things like push-ups and box positions. But holding a downward facing dog, there is a lot of pressure going through the wrist joints. So it's really important that your wrists are supple and mobile, and that you loosen them up to begin with. So we're just going to start. I'm going to assume that you've done a bit of mobility before this video anyway. If you are going to do the more advanced options, please do warm up properly. Use one of my other videos. But otherwise, I'm just going to quickly show you how I would loosen up my wrist joints for this pose in particular. And this, you can use this for planks, as I say, any position where you've got your hands down. So just roll the wrists, just circle them. Okay, take it both directions. Fold the hands forwards and back. Wiggle the fingers. Just work your elbows. Palms coming towards you, palms going away from you. So obviously there's a lot of loading in the upper body, the shoulder girdle in particular. So if you do have any shoulder issues, any neck issues, make sure that you prepare yourself. Do lots of mobility, lots of warming up first. Okay, and then just to decompress the wrist slightly, as we know it's a wrist that can get quite compressed up from loading, from putting weight into it. We are designed to put weight on our hands. Some people say we shouldn't do poses where you're putting a lot of weight in the wrists. We're not built for that. We are. When we're infants, we crawl, don't we, on hands and knees for quite a good few months. And the benefits of it is actually, as I said earlier, bone density. So the problem is, as adults, if we've not done anything for years, where we're putting weight on the hands, and then we suddenly start a yoga practice where we are doing that, you will find that your wrists are going to get sore. It took me maybe a year before my wrists felt really strong and really bulletproof doing some of these weight-bearing poses. So do persevere, as I say, little and often. But things like your wrist mobility, your decompression work can really help. So a couple of ways: thumb and middle finger, squeeze around the crease of the wrist, and just wiggle it, and you feel a bit of a pop and a release, just creating a bit of traction there. Quite a nice thing to do. Another way of doing it is just to gently pull the hand down whilst you pull the arm up and wiggle. So we're trying to create a bit of space around the wrist joint. And do this at any point, you know, when you're doing downward dog, if your wrists start to get a bit sore, come back to doing this, give them a bit of a release. And do it at the end of your practice as well. I find it helps at the end. I'll try and remember to show you a good stretch that you can do at the end for wrists. Right, so we've got the wrists loosened up. Do some shoulder circles, notice how your shoulders are feeling, relax around the neck. Now with downward dog pose, there's a few proportion things that have an impact on how people do downward dog. It's not all about, you know, how flexible, how strong you are. For example, if you've got quite broad shoulders and you try and bring a fairly narrow or shoulder base position, you might find that it's more kind of like this, that your shoulders are rounding up towards you. So you may need to go wider with your base basically. And there's a little part of our joint, our acromion joint, a acromion process across the top of our shoulder girdle here, which for some people can just literally get in the way of us getting that nice range of movement through our shoulders. So if you think about a downward dog, we want to draw the arms back, we're engaging our shoulder blades, we're trying to get this stretch here. But if you've got tension around here, or if this joint, the bony part of this joint is just built differently or shaped differently, you might never be able to get that angle whilst drawing your arms fully back. You might need to either go a little bit wider, or just bear in mind that you'll never get that complete range there. So never force it. Basic rule, if what's stopping you from going deeper into the stretch is tension, is kind of in the front, then you can increase that, you can stretch that and improve that over time. If what's stopping you going further is behind, so for example, my arm's going back, if the pain was here, there's a good chance that that's the bones, it's the joints, and you're not going to change that, you're just going to end up making yourself sore if you try and force into it. So just be aware that for some people, the actual shape of the shoulder girdle, the bony structure, will play a huge role in how you look in a downward dog. You might have to play around with this width of base. So shoulders and neck, important that we mobilise. Now obviously, because it's a load bearing posture, we want to make sure that the muscles built to stabilise us in strength work are actually switched on. And we know that these mid-back muscles around our rhombus, our kind of mid-upper trapezius muscles, can sometimes be a little bit switched off. So if you know that that's the case, if you tend to find that in weight-bearing poses you just feel like it's your arms and your shoulders doing all the work, that you never really get much help from these mid-back muscles, wake them up first, do a bit of activation work. Similar to how in some of our classes we sometimes do a bit of glute activation, guys. Sometimes doing a bit of mid-back activation can really help. It can just make you feel a bit stronger, a bit more comfortable. So obviously, if you've got someone to do that to you, tapping, drumming, massaging, brilliant. Another way is to get a tennis ball, put it on the wall, lean on it and just roll your mid back into it. I find these things are brilliant. I love this, it's my little massage gadget. Great when you can't get to your massage therapist. And they're also really good for activating. So it's just one of these basic pummel activators, and I would just work this all around my mid-back area, kind of moving up and down, just for a minute or two, just so these muscles are switched on, so they're starting to work and they're more receptive when we do start to ask them to put a bit of weight through them. So activating the mid-back muscles can really help as well, particularly if you've got any shoulder issues. It just gives you that extra element of protection. Now if we think about the shape of a downward facing dog, so it's that kind of triangle shape, isn't it? If we take that upright, all it is really in a nutshell, it's a right angle. So I'm going to demonstrate you standing. So all we do, we tip the pelvis forwards, think about tipping out the front of the bucket, and we're reaching our arms. So you could do this onto a wall or onto a table, and we're trying to get that right angle shape. So my feet are about hip width apart, and I'm rolling my hips forward, so I'm trying to lift my sit bones up. That's going to give me the stretch here, and then I'm stretching my arms out, pressing either onto my table or my wall. I'm letting my head just relax, and I'm getting that stretch through this front line here. All the stretch of the pose, a little bit of the weight bearing of the pose, but it's a way of getting used to the shape of the pose, the stretch of the pose, the balance of it, etc., without going upside down, without putting all that weight into the hands to begin with. So do try that first. If you've never done downward dog, just get used to doing that stretch on its own, and then we can kind of take that stretch and tip it onto the ground, so that we're actually taking it into our downward dog. Now, other things in downward dog, obviously it's an inverted pose. You're officially upside down, your head is below your heart, so you are increasing oxygen to the brain, blood pressure, blood to the brain. We're changing the flow, we are going to be upside down. So again, that's another factor to bear in mind if you're not used to it, little and often. Don't do it too long. Try not to come out of the pose too quickly either, especially if you tend to get a little bit dizzy when you come up from seated or lying down. You know, give yourself time to get used to it. But it's another reason why it's a great pose, because we get that energy boost from it. Couple of things with hands is the grip on the hands. Now, downward facing dog, what we need is to feel that we've got a really good connection with the floor, with both our hands and also both our feet. Hands in particular, because if your hands feel like they're slipping and sliding away from you, even if you're not aware of that, even if it's something that's happening, it doesn't really bother you, your brain will be aware of that. And what it's going to do, it's going to put a little red flag up that says we're not safe, we're not stable, we're slipping. So it's going to tighten the whole body and it will just make the pose feel more uncomfortable. So make sure that you've got good grip with your hands. So there's several things you can do. Obviously, you know, if your hands are fine just gripping, that's absolutely great. You can use things like sport chalk if you do find that your hands get a bit sweaty. Get some sport chalk. There's yoga gloves on the market now, grippy gloves that you can use. Sometimes it's just a case of you can even roll up the end bit of your yoga mat and you can perhaps hold on to that instead, so you've got that bit of cushioning across the wrist crease. You can use push-up handles. These are simple push-up bars from Decathlon. I think they're about £5 a pair. And I'm going to use these to push into. So again, it gives me that little bit of extra grip. This is a great way of working through the wrist pain issue. As I said earlier, if you just find that it's that bit that stops you, if you just can't cope because the wrist always gets sore before anything else, try a handle position, because that actually puts the wrist in a straight line. So rather than this deep flexed wrist joint that we'll have when we're on the ground, it puts you in that straight position, so it can just get you used to that bone density building stronger while you kind of get used to that. So there's a few options with the hands, but ultimately hand placement, what we want to feel is that we're pressing evenly right through the heel of the hand. If I get a little bit closer to camera. So we want to feel that we're kind of connecting across the heel of the hand, spreading the weight evenly through to the fingers. Even as if you're gently gripping with the pads of the fingers, we don't want to flatten the palm of the hand though. We're trying to create a little bit of a soft space there. So imagine you've got a 50p piece in the palm of your hand, and when your hands are flat down, we don't want to flatten that. We want to try and feel that we're slightly lifting out of that. So it gives us this strength, this activation in our hands and in our wrist joints, which again just means that you'll be able to hold the pose longer, you'll be able to hold it more comfortably. So you plant the hands, we're going to press from heel of hands, spread out through the fingers, pads of the fingertips are slightly gripping. Now, noticing as well the rotation of the wrist and forearm joint is a huge factor in downward facing dog. This movement here, the ability for us to rotate our wrist and forearm. So if I'm going to keep my upper arm still, so I've got that movement now, I've got about 180 degrees, I can go from palm down to palm up fairly easy. If I use my shoulder, I can go even further still. But it's that position there that's kind of quite important in downward dog, because if you haven't got great range to do that rotation, you're probably going to really struggle to get your palms flat. Your palms are going to tip out, which is kind of quite important because it's going to affect the shoulder girdle ultimately. It's going to affect that. If that won't rotate very easily, that has to do a little bit more work as well. So just being aware of what your range is in your radius ulnar, your wrist forearm joint, okay, being aware of what that movement is there. Also the width, as I said earlier, if you've got really broad shoulders, you're probably going to have to go a little bit wider. If you struggle to get your arms fully back, you're probably going to have to go a little bit wider. Basic rule I find is as long as you're symmetrical, as long as you haven't got one arm in and one arm out, you know, we want to feel that we're mirroring our left and right side so that the body's balanced. So come back into your box position, plant your hands down. Okay, and then just start to play around with what your shoulders are doing now, because we want to feel at the top of our shoulder that we can pull it away from our neck. We don't want it to scrunch up. We want to feel our shoulder blades engaged. We're drawing the shoulders away from the neck, away from the ears, and we're pulling them into the back body. That's going to be really important when we start to lift up, because one of the common mistakes that people often do in downward dog is they start to lift up, they let the shoulders scrunch up around the ears, and that just feels horrible. Straight away I've got all this compression building up around the neck. Doesn't feel very nice, and so that's just going to make me want to come out of the pose much quicker. So just being aware that once you've got your hands down, that you can draw your shoulders back, that you can pull them away from the ears. So I'm going to show you a little movement from the back now. So the thing again that I like to do, I like to practice with this, is just shrugging downwards. So think about your shoulder blades being pulled away from the neck, and then imagine they're hugging you from behind. And as you create that movement, that feeling, you should feel that your arms want to open, they want to draw out a little bit further, a little bit wider as well. Right, so coming into your box position now, I'm going to work a little bit on lower body position before we start to lift up. So downward facing dog, we want to try and get our pelvic position so that we're tipping out the front of our bucket, or anterior tilt. We're tipping forwards, which is quite an unusual position. A lot of yoga poses, we tend to prefer that kind of posterior tilt, so we're opening the lower back. But we want to feel that we're rolling the hips forward, so we're really lifting our sit bones up, we're lifting our tailbone up, and that's going to give you that nice lengthening down the back of the leg. So again, nice way of practicing this is to just do a few little pelvic tilts in your box position, and then stay with your pelvis tipping forwards. Now creating a stack, so I'm going to have my hips lined up above my knee joint here, so I'm tipping out the front of the bucket, and I'm just getting used to the feel of that. Now another variation on this is puppy dog pose. It's a way of practicing the kind of shape here of the pose without putting the weight into the hands just yet, and we're also going to start to include the stretch underneath the body. So I'm going to move a little bit further back on my mat. I've got my lower body position, I've got my pelvis tipping forwards, my tailbone's lifting up, gently engaging into my abdominal muscles, and I'm just going to start by coming down onto my forearms. So I want to keep my back in extension. Yeah, I want to feel that I'm still tipping out the front of the bucket, shrug my shoulders away from my ears. Then I'm going to plant my hands down, so I'm planting the hands, pressing from heel of hand through to fingertips, and I'm just going to drop my forehead to the ground, see how that feels. Now if that feels okay, I'm going to start to reach my arms out a little bit further now, so I'm starting to get the stretch in my shoulders, but I'm checking all the time that my shoulders aren't rolling up towards my ears. I want to keep them broad, and that's giving me a great stretch. I'm feeling the stretch that I would feel in a full downward dog, all underneath my shoulders, my armpits, my arms, my chest. Okay, so that's a way of getting used to the stretch in the upper body. See how it feels before we start loading all this body weight into it. If it's still easy, a little bit further from here, is you can just lift the head, come onto the chin. So we're dropping our chest towards the floor. We're now starting to get the real full feel of a downward dog, where we really start to draw into it and open this front body even deeper. It's just an option though, but you can play around with that as well. So practicing your puppy dog pose is really useful for coming into your downward dog, whether you're just here. When you come out, walk the hands in, bring up to the shoulders, use the hands to push yourself back up, and then just sit back for a moment. So a couple of little things with upper body then. So we know that we need to play around with this position. We're looking for evenness. We need to make sure that these mid-back muscles are active, so they're drawing our shoulders back and down, feeling the stretch across the chest, playing around with that rotation, which I will show you in just a second. But before we come through the full version, I'm just going to move on to the other end of the body, if you like. So we've looked at wrists. Another thing that's really important is ankles. Okay, because in a downward facing dog, when you see these lovely pictures in magazines, etc., they've nearly always got their heels flat to the ground. You know, they've got this perfect alignment. And again, that's great, and it's lovely if you can do that comfortably. But that angle here, getting the heels down, is dictated by several different things. It's not just about flexibility. For some people, again, it's the shape of the joint. So if you look at my range here, if I can kind of show you from an angle, I can push quite a long way. I've got quite freaky range of movement in my ankle joints, whether it's from horse riding as a child, I don't know, but I have got really good range in my ankle joint, which allows me to quite easily push my heels down, because my foot, my range is quite good here, and I can go a long way. So for me to push my heels to the ground isn't too much of a challenge. However, if your ankle joints were built differently, if you've got compression there or just the shape of the joint, you might not be able to get that deep flexion. So you might never get to the point where you can drop your heels to the floor. You might need to kind of stay with the heels slightly lifted, or perhaps use a yoga brick underneath the heels. So even though it's nice to do that, because we make more contact so we can kind of push a little stronger, don't worry if you can't. Yeah, don't kind of feel that you failed in the pose. Little indicator here to just see what might be going on. If you're trying to push your heels down and you can't because the stretch at the back here is too much, that means it's tension, it's the soft tissue. So over time you could probably increase that, you'll get your heels close to the ground. If, however, you're trying to push your heels down and they won't go, and you can feel it on the inside of the joint, the front of the foot, the front of the shin, here, if it's like a pinch or a squash sensation, that could be an indicator that it's just the shape of the foot, the bones of hip bones. You're not going to get beyond that without causing severe discomfort, so don't force it, yeah? So be aware of your ankle joint ability before you start kind of judging how good you are in a downward facing dog. If your ankles haven't got that range, you're probably never going to get your heels down, but it's not a problem. Doesn't mean you can't still get a lot of benefits from the pose. So again, obviously other factors are involved here. How much strength you've got in the lower body to balance the pose. Things like length of legs compared to length of upper body. So if you've got really long legs, you're probably going to find it a little bit easier to go in a wider base, because when we take a slightly wider base in downward dog, which basically means my hands are further away from my feet, or slightly broader base, I'm going to feel that a little bit more in my upper body, and it's going to take away some of the tension in my legs. If I've got really long legs, I might find that the stretch in my legs is just stopping me from being able to get into the pose. So, long legs, shorter arms, a slightly wider base, a slightly bigger difference from feet to hands is probably going to be more comfortable for you to begin with. You can always play around with it. Having said that, if you're the opposite, if you've got short legs and long arms, you might prefer to come a little closer with your base, okay? So you might find that that works. So do play around with that as well. Use that to see where you want more stretch. So for example, if you wanted to get more stretch in your legs, perhaps narrow the base, bring the hands close to the feet. If you wanted to get more load bearing, more stretch in the upper body, go a little bit wider, have a play. If you can do it in all placements, brilliant, chop and change. I'm a real fan of kind of varying yoga poses. Don't just do exactly the same way over and over and over again. Reason being as well is because if you have got a kind of tendency towards any injuries in those areas, if you're doing exactly the same, you're more likely to weed those injuries out. So we need to mix it up a little. We need to do variations on our poses, not just do exactly the same way time and time again. Right, so I'm going to talk you through now. So we're just going to move into the down dog a few different ways. So we've got our hand placement, spread the fingers out. Start by feeling that you're engaging the front body. So it's a balanced pose, it's a strength pose. So as well as our arms and legs loading and holding our body weight, we want to feel that our core muscles are helping to support us. We'll feel much safer in terms of the balance of the pose if they're switched on. So I'm gently engaging into my deep core muscles, pelvic floor is lifting up. My gaze is just down towards my hands, and I'm just going to shrug my shoulders away from my ears. Now, in downward dog, to come up to it just from a box position, you can either just tuck your toes, take a deep breath in, and you could just start to think about pushing your hips, your sit bones straight up to the ceiling, pushing through the heel of the hand, letting the body draw down, and then fidget the feet and start to work down into the heels. If you struggle with it though, or if you're quite a new beginner to downward facing dog, if you just want to make it a little bit of a better pose, more comfortable pose for you, have a fidget with it. So I'm going to start by lifting my knees up. So I've still got my legs bent, and I'm just going to do a little bit of wiggling. So I'm just rocking my hips, I'm adjusting, see how my hands feel at this point. Do they feel strong and safe? Can I push into them firmly? Start drawing my shoulders away, and then I'm just going to do some little tiptoe lifts, just rocking up and down through my ankle joint, see how that feels. You might find that repositioning the foot slightly gives you a better base as well. I'm going to think about my pelvis still tipping out the front of the bucket. My sit bones are lifting up. Knees are bent though, and I'm going to start to draw my body towards my legs. So my tummy and thighs come together. My front ribs are coming towards my knees. So as I do that, I'm starting to come deeper into the stretch. I'm starting to open up my upper back, my chest, my shoulders. So I'm trying to get here. But remember, for some people, you might not be able to get that. You might be more like this. This is what we're aiming towards, but don't worry if you don't get that kind of straight line. And do play around with hand position. Another thing that can sometimes help here is by just rotating slightly outwards. If I show from a different angle with the hands. So rather than having your fingertips pointing forwards, you might find that by rotating your hands very slightly outwards, by doing that slight movement, rolling the hands away, your shoulders start to come away from the neck. So you can get that pulling down of the shoulder blades. You can get that kind of opening of the upper body. So do play around with that rotation as well. When we tend to bring the hands in or forwards, what often happens is our shoulders lift up, our elbows tend to come out. When we rotate the hands out and we kind of dial them outwards, we're more likely to pull our shoulders down and back. So play around with that rotation in the hands to see what works for you. So from here then, so we're lifting the hips up, we've done our little hip wiggles, our knee bends, tiptoes, we've sharpened the pose, and then we're just going to relax the neck, let the head hang, feel the weight of the head, just let the head drop down. Start to take some nice deep breaths into it, and feel the connection that you've got now between both hands and both feet, because what we want to try and feel is that we're actively pushing the hands and we're actively pushing into the feet. So we're kind of pushing the floor away from us, but at the same time we're trying to lift the hips, lift the sit bones up towards the ceiling. We're trying to feel the front body being drawn towards the fronts of the legs. So we're getting this really nice stretch and strengthening effect to the pose. So we're pushing firmly into the floor, but at the same time we're trying to lift up. So it's like a two-way press, yeah? Our hands and feet are pushing down, our tail, our hips, our sit bones are trying to lift up to really get this feeling of lengthening the body. So that's our kind of basic pose. So do practice all those little bits coming up into that. Get to the point where you feel comfortable. But as I said, if your downward dog to start with looks more like this, or even a little bit more like this, that's fine. Work on what you've got. Get used to the work, the kind of loading, the building of strength, getting used to the pose, the comfort of it. Then we can start to play around with these bases. So as I said earlier, it's really important that we don't just do one variation on the pose, that we try and mix it up a little bit. So when you've got to the point where a basic downward dog shape is comfortable for you, you can start mixing it up. You can start working on maybe taking a narrow base for a change. So we would bring our feet together rather than have them hip width. Keep your hands wide. Starts to play around with the balance, makes the balance of the pose a bit more challenging. You might find it gives you a bit more of a stretch. Outside line, maybe the outer edges of your calves, outer hips and thighs. So it's a way of kind of varying the feel of your downward dog. We can also do the same with our hands. So we take our feet back to our wide base, bring our hands together now. So my thumbs are touching, my fingers still pointing forwards. A little bit trickier. I'll show you from a different angle. So again, less balance going, less base going on here, so it's making the balance a little bit more challenging. If you feel comfortable, you could do both together. This is even more challenging on the balance. So we've got a real narrow base downward dog. Still trying to keep all those other factors in line. So I'm tipping out the front of my bucket, my legs are super glued together now. I'm kind of drawing my mid-back muscles up, my head's hanging. And I'm just breathing nice and easy. So that's your way of playing with your base. We can also do the opposite of that. We can start to take it a wider base. So I'm going to go a little bit wider with my hands and feet. Now, this depends on, again, grip, moving off the mat. So if you feel comfortable, you can start to take your feet outside the mat. We can start to drop the body down. So we're getting a little bit more of a stretch. Coming now into, I'll show you from a different angle again. So from my normal base, I'm going to start to play around with working my feet out even wider, even see how far you could comfortably go. Still tipping out the front of my bucket so my hips are lifting up, my arms are reaching forwards, drawing my shoulders away. Just checking, I've not mentioned elbows. Make sure that you don't lock the elbow joint out. Nothing inherently wrong with locking the elbow joints out. You know, it can build a bit of bone density there, but it's just the tendencies that we can just overextend or put a bit too much pressure in. So also keeping the elbow very slightly soft, it means your muscles are going to be more active, so we're going to build that strength. So just try and be aware of the elbow joint, that you're not locking. Same with the knee joint. You can, there's nothing bad with locking out, but if we keep a slight softness in the knee, we just keep those muscles a little bit more active. Having said that, if you love to lock out, if you like that feel, you know, I'm hypermobile in my knees and my elbows. Sometimes I like to really lock and extend because it gives me a better stretch. But just being aware that you're doing it and trying to support by gently engaging the muscles around that area. So that's our wide base downward dog. I'm just going to try and show you from a different angle. So this is now going to give me a bit more of a stretch in the thighs, groin, sort of variation on that pose. Really nice way of playing around with the pose. Again, if you've got long legs, you might find that you can touch the ground much easier, that you can drop the body down, because it makes the legs shorter. Yeah, if we're stepping a wider base, our legs become shorter in proportion to our body and our arms. So it's a way of kind of playing with that. So that's a few variations on that. I'm going to show you a couple of more advanced options now than with downward dog. So there's a pose sometimes referred to as scorpion's tail. It's a single leg downward facing dog. So I'm going to work you through that, and then I'll show you a nice little upper body twist as well that we can do in downward facing dog. So we're going to start with this scorpion tail. So we plant the hands, we come up to our downward dog, lifting the hips up. And all I'm going to do, I'm going to make sure both of my hands are super glued to the ground, they're nice and strong. I'm going to shift my weight into one leg. I'm going to shift my weight into my left leg. My right leg, I'm just going to start to raise it up.
So just do that a few times first. Get used to the difference in balance here now. Yeah, I've taken one of my supports away, so get used to that. Now I'm going to keep lifting that leg up and I'm going to start to let it rotate out. So I'm allowing my pelvis to tip back. I'm keeping my chest down. I'm trying to keep my body towards my standing leg, but I'm going to float that leg up to the ceiling and I'm just going to start to bend and extend through the knee. So I'm bringing my heel towards my glute. Now if you've got the range, you can let the heel come towards the bum. You're opening the hip, you're rotating, you're allowing that leg to just fall back. Also keeping hands pressed, particularly the right hand in this position. You'll find that wants to come up. Yeah, so you want to feel that both hands stay super glued to the ground. So we've got this opening. And what this does, this variation, obviously a bit more strength involved here, a bit more balance, but it starts to give you a really nice stretch all the way down this kind of lateral line through your obliques, your lower back. So it's a nice variation on the pose. I'm going to show you from the opposite leg. So plant the feet down. So we're going to start, just lift and lower that leg up a few times, see how that feels, get used to the balance. And then you're going to lift, bend and extend through the knee. Okay, and then keeping both hands firmly planted, particularly my left hand now because I've got my left leg lifted. I'm allowing that hip to rotate out and up towards the ceiling. Okay, squeezing my mid-back muscles, holding that stretch, coming back to centre. So as it's a nice stretch for these lateral lines, you're also starting to open up into the hip flexor here as well. So it'll give you a little bit of a stretch in that area, so that's a nice variation. Right, so second variation, we're going to do a little twist in our downward dog. So we come back up into it. Okay, I'm going to take my feet a little wider than a regular base, than my hip distance base, just so I've got a bit more balance and it gives me a bit more to reach for. And then I'm going to place my left hand right in the centre. So that's now going to be my support. Okay, my right hand, I'm going to bring it off the ground and I'm going to reach across either to the outside of my left thigh, maybe my calf, or if I can, I'm going to reach across to my left shin. So I'm keeping extension, chest is away from belly button, and I'm rotating, looking underneath my left armpit. So I'm going to show you this from a different angle. So I've got that slightly wider base, left hand is centre, right hand, so I'm either just going to reach for here, calf if I can. Again, if you've got long legs, or short arms, it's going to be more difficult to reach further down the leg. So go where you find it's comfortable. If it's easy, I'm going to use this hand to pull. So I'm kind of wringing out these back muscles, and then I would change sides. So right hand's going to come centre, tipping out the front bucket, left hand's going to come off the ground, get the balance. So I'm reaching maybe thigh, shin, calf, ankle, and I'm rotating, wringing out my mid-upper body, looking underneath my right armpit. Okay, nice twisting pose, nice stretch. Okay, coming back to centre, dropping back down. And just drop back into your child pose every now and then as well. It's quite a nice release. Let your arms just go quite floppy, draw your shoulders away. Okay, coming back up. Now I'm going to show you moving up into downward dog because we've been kind of working on it just as a pose on its own, really kind of moving back and forth into it from your box position. But when we're doing it in obviously in a sun salutation or a moon salutation, we might be coming up through from a plank or from a cobra pose. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways of how to make that a little bit more easy or a bit more comfortable. So if I imagine we're starting from our basic cobra, so arms are just going to rest here for a moment, give yourself a bit of a shape, and then we're going to come up to our full version. So hands are going to come into our ribs, shoulders roll back, elbows hug my sides, squeeze my glutes, push my pubic bone down, take the time and come up slowly to cobra. Okay, so we're coming from here. So you could, from cobra, you could either just pull back up into your box. If you're doing sun salutation, this might be a great way of doing it for you if you're getting used to it. And then you just lift up, as we've just been doing. Or you could start to think about coming into your upward dog, so we tuck the toes, or we press the feet. We're going to think about the front body being pulled up as we push the floor away, and we're just going to shoot the hips straight up to the ceiling. Okay, and then once we're here, we would readjust the lower body position, have our fidget, come into the pose. Okay, and then as we come out, we can lift up onto tiptoes, Start to come forwards, front body engaged, so abs are engaged. We're going to lower the hips, draw the shoulders back, and we're back up to cobra, and then we could lower gently back to the floor. So it's another way of kind of building the pose, making it a bit more of a strength pose as well, is to just transition up. So I'll show you that once more. So from your cobra position, so we would lift up to cobra. If you like, now I struggle to do this because as you all know, I've got a very dodgy toe, an arthritic big toe joint, so I do struggle to roll over my feet. But in some styles of yoga, there is very much a case of where they kind of lift up onto the top of the foot and then they would roll over onto the ball of the foot. So if you've got the ability in your toes to do that, brilliant. It's a nice way of moving. I prefer to just place my foot rather than roll through it. And then the same as we come out, so we're going to come forwards and down and then just reposition my feet as to where they are. Okay, so that's moving up and down into your downward facing dog. So it is a lovely pose. Remember, as I said, loosening wrists afterwards, so circling the hands, give them a bit of a shake at any point, squeeze. A little stretch that I find is quite nice to do when you've been doing a lot of downward dog is to come into a simple forward fold. And if you can't reach the ground, again, if you've got really long legs, don't worry, you can have your knees slightly bent here. And you're going to place your hands underneath your feet. So you're stepping on the palm of your hand. Your toes are basically along your wrist crease and your fingers, or your fingertips, are kind of pushing towards your heel at the back of your foot. So I'm going to step onto both my hands now, and I'm stepping quite firm. I'm kind of pressing the ball of my foot down, so I'm squashing the back of my hand into the floor, and then all I'm doing, I'm pulling up as if I'm trying to pull my arm away from my hand and leave it there, and you'll feel a really nice release of tension. The back of the wrist and forearm kind of opens up that space in the back of the wrist joint. So that's quite a nice way of countering the pressure that we put on the wrist joint when we are doing downward facing dog and those type poses. So we could hold this, so I'm pulling upwards. So as I said, if you can't do this with straight legs, you can still get the same feel here, you know, bend your knees, push your hips back, but feel that you're pulling up. So we're trying to create that traction back into the wrist joint. And it just means that you're less likely to get sore wrists the next day. But obviously practice little and often. The key is to kind of build up to these poses. Now I just want to show you one last movement with your downward facing dog, just kind of walking back and forth out of it, which can be quite a nice way of moving into downward dog. So we could, for example, we can either do this from the front of your mat, come into a forward fold, and then all you're going to do is soften the knees, think about tipping out the front of the bucket. You're going to step back, left leg, deep breath in, step back, right leg, and then scoop the hips up and move into your pose that way. Or if you're at the back of your mat, move into your forward fold, and then you would walk forwards, plant the hands, have a little fidget, move into your downward dog that way. So there's lots of ways that we can kind of move back and forth into it. We can use it in sequences, we can use it as a pose on its own. We can do our leg work. There's variations obviously with downward facing dog when you've got to the point where you're happy doing things like your leg raises. You know, we can start to transition this through, moving through to our lunges, our twisting poses, you know, stepping through to things like standing splits pose. So it's a great way of just getting used to the shape of a downward dog pose, adding bits into it, challenging yourself with it. Even doing single corner work, sometimes doing things like, you know, lifting one leg at a time, one corner at a time, one arm at a time, will get you used to the stability of the pose, the weight bearing, it'll get you used to which side you need to work on. For example, you might suddenly decide that your left side is a lot less stable when you bring that hand up, or your right side. So do play around with the pose. I hope you've enjoyed that little tutorial. As always, any feedback is welcome, any tips and ideas. But what I will say with downward dog, it's a lovely pose. To start off with, it can feel really intense, really uncomfortable to hold it for long periods. Once you have got used to it, and once you feel comfortable in it, you feel safe in the pose. It's such a great pose for strengthening upper body, really stretching the back line of the body. Great energising. You can see now I'm a little bit lightheaded because I've been upside down. So, as I said, come out of it slowly, but I hope you've enjoyed that. Thanks, guys. Namaste.